Welcome back to another episode of the update. I've got John Riley, Saul Klein, and myself, Tristan. We're staying busy. At least I'm trying to keep up. And I don't know if it's working, but Saul and John are keeping up. So guys, thanks for jumping in on this one. I appreciate you.
Yeah, great. Likewise, Tristan, great to be here. John, always great to see you. We talk about this stuff every day. Well, Tristan, we thought this might be an opportunity to kind of do a summary of the major parts of what we've been talking about. Because, repetition is the mother of learning. And so,
Yeah.
as much as this has been out there, you'd be surprised how many people still don't quite get the big picture. So, for a lot of people, this might be old hat, but I doubt it. Even people that think they know a lot about this, I think can benefit from some of the things that we'll recover as we go through this. And then maybe we can even talk about some new litigation if we get time.
Yeah, I agree. I agree. All right. So you sent an outline, or both of you sent an outline, and it starts with knowledge is power paradigm shift. Take me through that, and then we'll get into the civil class action.
Yeah, so we always like to start by saying that the more you know, the better off you are. And the more detailed you in your understanding, not that you have to talk about it in detail, the more detailed your understanding, the better. And you've heard people talk, this is a brave new world. This is a new beginning. You hear all this. Well, it's what we've called a paradigm shift, which is a fundamental, not just a little change, fundamental change to the way you do business. And so that's major. People need to realize it. It's not about just little tweaks here and there. It's a fundamental change. And we used to ask these paradigm shift questions that help people discover the future. Joel Barker wrote a book called Future Edge, and he talked about discovering the future. How do you discover the future? You get to the edge of your paradigm of your current paradigm, which is the way you do things, and then you ask yourself a couple of questions. And one of them is, what's currently possible? And if it were impossible, it would fundamentally change the way you do business. What's currently possible, and if it were impossible, it would fundamentally change the way you do business. Well, what was currently possible was the MLS was an offer of compensation.
Yep.
That's no longer possible. So that is a paradigm shift question. Used to be able to use the MLS to determine compensation, can't do it anymore. Your business is going to change. And another paradigm shift question: uh, was currently for most people impossible, and if
Mm-hmm.
it's possible, would fundamentally change the way you do business.
Mm-hmm.
Getting buyers to sign contracts committing to pay you money. That
Yeah.
for a lot of people was not possible. But if it were possible, would it fundamentally change the way you do business? So when a paradigm shifts, everyone goes back to zero and your past success guarantees nothing. So you need to know, if you're a real estate practitioner today, you need to know about this. You need to understand this. You need to be able to articulate this to buyers and sellers. You need to have people like John Riley and Tristan who can explain these things to you. And the more you know, the better, huh, John?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So let's get into it.
All right, let's go.
Yeah,
Where
so
are we at with the civil class action lawsuit with Sitzer?
well, first thing that people need to understand is that it is civil, the settlement, right? This is over our head. It's called the settlement. It's called the NAR proposed settlement. What is it settling? And the answer is it's settling the civil class action litigation. The case was entitled Sitzer Burnett. It took place in Missouri, where the jury determined that realtors had been artificially holding commissions high through their MLSs across the country.
Mhm.
And there was a $1.83 billion judgment against a number of defendants, NAR, major brokerage firms. And then because it was antitrust, it was tripled, $5 billion. And so the National Association of Realtors stepped up and they settled. And so people lose sight of what it means, what settlement means. And John, why don't you explain the value of a settlement?
Well, the main value, let's say, if you were a realtor, you would be released of liability. And if you're an MLS and you complied with the settlement, you would be released from liability. So the idea of the release is very important. And it does pertain to realtors who are realtor up to the date of notice. And the date of notice, believe it or not, is August 17th. So if you were a realtor up to that time, you're covered, released, as long as you comply with the practice changes in the settlement. And if, however, you're a licensee who now decide you want to join the NAR, you would not be covered by this settlement. So the August 17th date is kind of a cutoff for the release of liability.
Well, and so when we say release of liability, what that means is anybody for the previous 4 years who transacted real estate, what the judgment said and what then was agreed to is the commissions that were paid may have been excessive. And so if you didn't have a settlement protecting you, you might be involved in litigation where all of your transactions over the past 4 years, the sellers come back and say, Tristan, you overcharged me. I only should have had to pay 1%. I paid 3%. And so you owe me 2% on every deal you did in the last 4 years. And that could be a ton of money. And this settlement protects you.
Perfect.
Major
I like that summary. I like that summary. All right. So then the NAR proposed settlement is supposed to be finalized November 26th. We've been talking about the Department of Justice possibly stepping in at some point or pointing their finger or sneezing on this document in some form, doing something. Why haven't they? Are they? What's going on?
Well, what we just found out last Friday was the fact in an announcement by Attorney General Garland himself that there is a new action by the Department of Justice, not against the real estate residential business, but about the multi-party rental business. You know, for people, companies that kind of dominate that marketplace. They've been filed an antitrust civil action directly by the Department of Justice. So the Department of Justice has been very busy over the last couple of years. And maybe now that explains a little bit why they haven't come yet and intervened into the NAR settlement. But maybe now they're going to go into second gear and move a little faster with whether or not they're going to intervene and file a statement of interest in the NAR settlement.
So we're still waiting the current, they keep calling it proposed, right? The current proposed NAR settlement that protects everybody. The Department of Justice has actually made a public statement that said it's good, but it doesn't go far enough. And that's why everybody's waiting for the Department of Justice to weigh in. But as of this point, they're not a party to this litigation, nor are they a party to the settlement. And what that means for realtors is what you're doing and preparing for right now might change between now and November. Might not, but it might change between now and November 26th because the Department of Justice might have something to say about the settlement as it's currently structured.
Well, I mean, they're also busy with Google and Apple and Amazon to an extent. I feel like they're kind of spreading themselves thin, and they're going after all these companies or entities that they feel are monopolizing in one way or another, which is interesting, right? It's a trend.
Yeah, well, the White House actually, what year was it, John? 2021, they put out an executive order that actually outlined all the industries they were going to go after. And it's like it's taken some time, but you know what? It does take time to put cases together. And so they've had like 3 years or 3.5 years, and they've been putting these cases together, and boom, now they're starting to hit. And if you go back and look at that executive order, you'll find that exactly what they said they were going to do, they're doing.
Yeah,
That's not.
tying arrangements in real estate listing practice is exactly what they say verbatim in that order.
All
So
right.
something else about this settlement is it's good for 7 years. Now, what happens after 7 years, hard to say, but maybe they think that everybody will be used to doing business a new way, and it'll be fine in 7 years.
That's what I mean. That sounds logical, right?
Yeah, yeah, 7 years. And maybe they'll find in 7 years people aren't complying and they got to go back in and make it tighter.
So I have a question then about currently. Let's say the next few weeks or months, because I read the outline you guys have here. When it comes to fines, because we're watching in Lab Code Agents and in other groups or on social, or we're getting emails saying, look at all the people that are getting fined and look at all these fines. Where are they getting fined from? Are those fines that are normally happening outside of what we're going through? Or are they fines because of the settlement? Take me through this.
Yeah, so multiple listing services to ensure compliance, and the reason and everything, because we want the data clean. We want to make sure if a listing is on the market, we know it's on the market. We want to know if a listing closes, it's taken off of the MLS. We want to make sure the information is accurate. So MLSs, to make sure they maintain accurate information, they have structures for enforcing, and fines are a good way to enforce rules. Well, now with the proposed settlement and with the practice changes, paragraph 58, with the practice changes, and because it's so important for people to be compliant, because the penalty can be so dear if you are not compliant, MLSs are saying, well, how do we make realtors follow the rules? How do we make sure they don't include the word compensation? How do we make sure they do the things they're supposed to do? Because we, the MLSs, are charged with doing that. And one way is fines. And so MLSs across the country have come out and said, look, here's everything you need to know. Don't tell me you don't know. Here's everything you need to know. And if you don't do it right, you're going to put us at risk, and we're going to fine you. And it's going to be big. One of the big MLSs in here in California, they're fining $2,500. And that's enough to put some people out of
Wow.
business. And
Yeah,
so
some people think.
yeah, at a time when, also remember, buyers agents are going to have to get contracts with buyers, and maybe they're not good at it. Maybe they're not going to be able to get those contracts. So maybe they're not going to be able to do any deals. And now they might get slapped with a $2,500 fine. So I was out in Del Mar and doing a presentation on this for my MLS at a caravan, right? To kind of always try to keep people up to date. And this settlement, and we'll talk about it in a minute, is not explicit in every area. It's kind of vague. It's so vague that John and I don't understand it sometimes, and we have to talk about it and go back and forth. And if John and I don't understand it in total clarity, I can't imagine for some realtors out there, what they see when they read this thing and when they listen to all these YouTube videos and when they read all these articles and when they go to TikTok, and there's all these myths, right? And so if they don't understand it, if John and I don't understand, how can we say to an agent, well, you got to understand it, and if you don't understand it, you're going to get fined. So some MLSs are fining, some are fining big time. Here in San Diego, our board of directors of our MLS, we made a decision that we're not going to fine for violations for the first 60 days. We know
Okay.
that people are going to have a hard time. We don't want to push them out of business. We want them to learn how to comply, and we don't want them to worry about how much are they going to get fined. If we see, and we've got our compliance software turned on, it's going to find things that we think are violations, and we're going to call them and we're going to talk to them and we're going to remove the offending words, but we're not going to fine them over it. Not for the first 60 days.
I like
Right?
that. You're guiding them and saying, hey, this won't work. Just take it off. Next one. Just know that you shouldn't do that. I like that.
Different approach, right? Carrot and stick. Sometimes you can, my mother said, you catch more flies with honey right? It's like it doesn't always work, or at least people might become aggravated with you if that's your only approach. And we're here to help the industry. We're here to help create a marketplace for people who list and sell real estate, not to look at this new settlement as a revenue source, right?
Very true. Very true. All right. What about when the settlement is vague? Because you mentioned you were talking to John, and then sometimes you're like, wait a second, what does this actually mean? You're going back and forth, and you're like, wait, this is super vague. We don't even know what
Yeah.
it means. Where do we go to?
Well, remember we talked about paragraph 58. So
Yep,
if
I
you
remember that.
look at the settlement, it's 108 pages. But the interesting thing is the practice changes take up about 4 pages, and there's 13 items.
Hmm.
So when you read those 13, that's what you're tied to, those 13 items. Now, they're not crystal clear. There's a couple things that are crystal clear, but most of it's not crystal clear. So out of this 4 pages of vagueness comes all of this. This is what you should do. This is what you should not do. This is what's accepted. This is what's not accepted. And I give you an example. One of the things that the settlement says you can do is you can offer compensation off MLS. It says you cannot offer compensation through the MLS, but off the MLS, you can offer compensation. Now you hear brokers and experts saying you can't offer compensation off MLS either. And that's not true. Now, we're not saying that you should offer compensation off MLS. We're saying that when people say that, they're guessing. They're making something up. Now, could you infer that the Department of Justice wants to eliminate compensation altogether, and at some point they might? You could. You think the Department of Justice could come back and sue you for things that they didn't make clear ahead of time? I don't think so. And so right now, if you want to follow the settlement says no offers of compensation through the MLS, but it says you can offer compensation off the MLS. And that's just an example of the fact that people are interpreting these 13 items, which we've gone over in a previous program.
Well, on that, I sent you guys a picture of a for sale sign with an underneath a rider underneath it, and it says a buyer offering buyer compensation. And I wanted to make sure because I don't know. And you guys are like, no, all clear. It looks good. It's, from what we can tell, right? So that was cool.
Yeah. Well, and now
Yeah.
some brokers are saying we're not going to do it. We're going to back off. Compensation being broker to broker compensation, commission sharing. They're saying we know that's going to go away, so we don't allow it. But the person that put compensation offered on their sign, they're certainly not, and John, weigh in here, they're certainly not violating the proposed settlement agreement.
Yeah, it's a phrase that I've had a problem with, and I'm sure managing brokers have a problem with, because they're saying, hey, I just got a call from a cooperating broker, and he wanted to know what kind of concessions the seller is offering, or is there any offer of compensation that the seller is willing to do? What's the response of the person receiving that call? Well, according to the NAR settlement, is this included under off MLS conversation? Personally, I know that the Department of Justice is going to be taking a hard look at that, because I know they're not in favor of the offer of compensation to come into play until you get to the purchase offer stage, where it can be negotiated between the seller and the buyer, or they might allow the seller to do a direct offer to the buyer broker. And some brokerage companies have a form for that type of direct offer from the seller. See, it's not a sharing arrangement between broker to broker. It's from the seller to the buyer's broker.
Yeah, so an important point is that the settlement is vague. It's got 13 points. And it
Yeah.
says you can offer compensation off MLS. It says that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, somebody out in the street says you can't offer compensation according to the settlement. Well, according to the settlement, you can. But remember, this isn't final yet. And the DOJ hasn't weighed in yet. But if you read the settlement itself, it very, very clear says you can off MLS offer compensation. So you have a
Yeah. Well,
question about that? Ask your
I,
broker.
well, I have a question here, because this is the one question that we get now. Now that it's out and people are out there exploring and doing their thing, I'm gonna call up John. Let's say, hey, John, it's Tristan. Listen, I have a client that's interested in your property. Are you guys offering? Is your seller offering any type of compensation or concession? Well, can we have that conversation fully, or does that come down to the broker or the MLS? What is the answer on that one?
Well, let's talk about first concession and compensation because you got to
Yep.
define terms, huh?
Perfect.
So compensation within the environment of MLS usually is from the listing broker to the selling broker, from the listing broker to the buyer broker. That's that's a sharing arrangement, and that's compensation, money paid from the listing broker to the selling broker to the buyer's broker. Now, though, there also is the idea of the seller paying compensation directly to the buyer broker. That's a new way to look at compensation. And another way is where the buyer broker pays compensation to their own agent. They can do that. There's nothing that stops that. And so compensation is like the payment of a fee to the practitioner, either from one practitioner to another or from principal to practitioner, seller to practitioner, buyer to practitioner. That's compensation. And compensation, although it doesn't say what kind, in the settlement off MLS is still allowed. And that means if you called me and said, is your seller willing to pay compensation? There's nothing that says in writing that you can't do that now. It might come later, but you could. Now, concession is when the seller concedes or gives something to the buyer. Take the agents out of this for a minute. The seller gives something to a buyer. Now, the most common concession, I think, is probably when the seller accepts a lower than the listed price. That's a concession.
Yep.
Sellers are allowed to do that. Hey, I said I wanted $500,000. Oh, but okay, I'll offer you $495. Okay, I'll take it.
Yeah.
That's a concession. Concessions are allowed. Concessions have always been allowed. Now, what if the buyer says, I want you to pay my closing costs? I want you to pay the title insurance. Well, that's allowed. The seller can pay that. That's always been allowed. So concessions are allowed. They've always been allowed. The settlement says they're allowed. Concessions, as opposed to compensation. Concessions are allowed even in the MLS. Compensation is not, but concession is. That's allowed through the MLS. The question is, how do you say that in the MLS? How do you make the buyer brokers aware that the seller is willing to pay concession? And what John and I say is sellers are always willing to listen to somebody who asks for a concession. Just ask. And if you
I love
ask, I might say yes, I might say no, but it's allowed.
Very easy. John, anything on that?
Well, I find it interesting that if the seller at 500,000, that's the listing price. If the listing broker knows that the seller would take 490,000, can the listing broker say to anybody, oh, by the way, I know it's listed at 500,000, but I know the seller will take 490. Well, we know that that would be a serious breach of fiduciary duty, and they won't make that disclosure.
Yeah.
Could they do a similar thing with, well, how about a concession from the seller? What kind of concession regarding the price would the seller make? I don't think that could be disclosed.
Yeah, so any type of disclosure you'd make along that line, you have to get permission from the seller to do it.
Got it. So
Right.
then let me then transition over to the concession piece. If I'm submitting an offer and for my buyer, and in it, my buyer is requesting for concession, two things. One, concession for, let's say, they know they went through the property as a broken window. They're like, you know what? I need $1,000 for that big window in the kitchen. It's going to cost me that much. And number two, X percentage to pay my agent as well. I'm going to include those two things inside of the contract. Nothing wrong with that.
Nothing wrong with that. You're encouraged to do that.
Got it. What if I remove the window concessions and just put in the buyer's agent's commission?
Well,
Does that
as
change
long as it's coming from the buy side, the buyer can ask for anything they want. Right? The buyer is not precluded from asking for anything.
Mhm.
Where you'd have to be careful is in offering it on the listing side.
Got it.
Right, John?
Yeah.
Yeah, because then it goes back to broker, right?
Yeah. Yeah, at any point prior to the actual negotiation of the purchase agreement, anything at an earlier stage is, in my mind, kind of suspect.
Yeah, I agree. And then we touched on this a couple of times in the last two one webinar podcast, which is the remarks in the agent remarks section. You were saying that seller will entertain all offers. You recommend that that's the way we write it out.
Yeah, I would say so. Before a property goes into escrow or before it begins to go through the settlement process, in the MLS, you're gonna state there's a place where you can state remarks, and there's also confidential remarks. And if you want to convey to somebody who works with a buyer that your seller is flexible, you're entitled to do that. Now you have to be careful that people don't read it as compensation. They could read it as concession. Our thought about it is both of those words, if you can avoid them on the listing side. So in the remarks section, I would say state something like seller will entertain all offers. Doesn't that say if you asked that the seller might pay a buyer broker, seller will entertain all offers? Now,
Everything, like bring anything to me, I'm going to take a look at it.
yep.
Right.
Now, some MLSs, they've included boxes, concession, yes, no. Now, in my mind, you don't need to tell a buyer or an agent that represents a buyer that the seller might entertain concessions, because every seller wants to see every offer. The matter of fact, the law is that you must present all offers unless patently frivolous. You must present all offers. And so the buyer should ask for it. And in the MLS, I think it actually is something that will be frowned upon. And I'm actually seeing some MLSs who put that out there, concession, yes, no, they're removing it.
They should, because I was actually convinced while talking to both of you guys. I was like, oh, you know what? It makes sense because I have a fiduciary duty to the seller. And if I'm already putting it out there that we're taking concessions, I mean, that puts that at risk.
Yeah, and what agent or seller would say if there was a box concession, yes, no? Which one? Who would check the no box?
Yeah, exactly, man.
Right.
Wouldn't that deter some offers?
Yeah.
We don't want to deter offers. We want offers. We want more offers.
Yeah.
And so you want to do everything you can to encourage people to make offers. This idea that you need a checkbox to tell people what everybody knows is stupid.
Yeah,
and could eventually cause problems down the road. So why mess around with it? Remark section, seller will entertain all offers. I think that says it all.
Yep.
And then, right? And then there's post, and this has always been a capability, once the offer closes, once the deal closes, you want to close out your listing sold. It is important for appraisers and agents when they're doing CMAs to know what went into the sale price of this property, because that'll help me price the property for a new listing I'm taking. And so there is the capability in MLSs. Now the concession yes, no makes sense after it closes. Concession. If the seller made no concessions, you check no, you're done. If you check yes, different MLSs are going to have different approaches. What happens at our MLS is if you check yes, then you have a text free-form field where you can enter into up to 100 characters. You could put the amount of the concession. You could say repairs, X amount of dollars, closing costs, X amount of dollars, other X amount of dollars. Some MLSs are actually putting categories in that box to where you could do that, but we don't think that's necessarily wise at this point, when you can just put in the amounts that you want to put in, stay away from concessions to buyer agents, because that's could be an issue down the line, but you still can enter after the sale concessions that the seller was willing to make to sell that property.
All right, then let's wrap up with this last piece. We have still a lot on the sheet, but we could go on for a while. I think we'll save some of this for the next time. This is what I want to touch on because we're out there showing property, and some people, some agents are going direct for the buyer broker, and some are getting it, some are struggling. And then yet some are using a type of touring a property contract or document. Where do we start with that?
Well, we've seen some samples of a generic type of touring agreement or something to use at an open house. I've always struggled a little bit of a difference between an open house and a touring arrangement. The open house is kind of open to the public, and listing broker is there. On a touring, often the cooperating broker gets a key or access to go to the property with their client and tour there with the client. So I don't know, that distinction has not been truly made between the open house and the touring, but it's something that is a difference in my mind. But it shows the importance of having an agreement, a contract which adequately covers the cooperating broker, the buyer's broker, seeing the property. And I think we've in the earlier session had some suggestions about a short-term showing agreement that satisfies the settlement requirements, but is something which might have a shorter expiration date, so that there's time to have a relationship develop between the buyer broker and the buyer client. It's hard to have that relationship and fix a price for that when you have a first time meeting with a buyer who wants to see an open house, for example.
Well, so, and John and I are not necessarily on the same page when it comes to, in my mind, there's no question about the fact that of course, we're on the same page here. If you're going to take a buyer out and show them property, you got to have a contract with them.
Mm-hmm.
If somebody comes to your open house and you have a contract with the seller, you represent the seller. You don't represent the buyer just because the buyer walks in the door. You have matter of fact, you have to fulfill your duty to the seller, because in your agreement, you probably agreed to market the property for sale.
Yeah.
So to make that property available through an open house, as long as you're working for the seller, you can do that without asking the buyer. You're not touring them at all. They came to the property. You're not taking them to another property after the fact. So in my mind, you're not touring them. They came, they're there, they can go through the property. You can take them through without asking them to sign anything. Now, if you were going to ask them to sign something, I think that a buyer would be wary of signing something to agree to pay you anything. Okay, welcome to open house, before I show you anything, you have to sign this agreement. And by the way, you're going to owe me money if the seller won't pay. I think that creates an issue. So on an open house, some states might develop forms, some brokers might develop forms that you want to look at and you might want to use. But I don't think you're automatically on the hook to get something written from a buyer who walks through the door at an open house. Just be careful how you talk to them, and don't lead them with any expectations that you're working for them. Make it clear you're working for the seller.
I totally agree with that. In fact, I know that some listing brokers on the sign out front say in there, "We represent the seller." You know, they're trying to make it clear to people coming to the open house. So, you know, each broker is going to have their policy on that. And I think the listing broker should have something that establishes that they are there as the representative of the seller.
Could be your sign-in book. You ever use a sign-in book? Right at an open house? You could put a paragraph at the top that says, "I represent the seller." I mean, get your attorney to look at it and say, you know, "Welcome to the open house. We represent the seller. We have a fiduciary duty to the seller." And matter of fact, you do want to ask, are you working with an agent? If you're working with an agent, you have an arrangement or a contract with the agent, but you don't need to get them to sign an agreement of any kind or a disclosure at that point. They're coming in of their own free will by themselves. Or if they're coming in with an agent, you're going to assume that the agent, they got a contract with the agent. And so you don't need to get them, right?
So let's take the open house out. Let's say they come in as an online lead and they want to go take a look at a property. They don't want to sign a full commitment, maybe a touring guide for California. Just so people listening in, for California, what document would that be? And is there any payment attached to that official document?
Well, so there could be, we know brokerage firms are starting to develop these types of documents, and the compensation is tough unless you, particularly with an online lead, they don't know who you are. And so to be able to get them to commit monetarily right off the bat, I think is an issue. So you could make it a low to no fee, but a short expiration. So you're not bound to that. The other side of that is when you're talking to somebody about signing an agreement where they're actually employing you, remember that if you find a seller that's willing to pay more than the contract, you can't take it. And so, you know, figure out a way to convey your compelling argument to maximize the amount of money that the buyer would pay you. And then if the seller asks you to negotiate that, you got room to negotiate that, right?
Start higher. Start higher.
Just be able to convey that, right? Articulate it, but yeah.
Value, right? Show the value, you can start higher, right?
Yeah.
You know, Tristan, one of the good things about raising this issue is the whole fact that now a lot of companies are writing their own forms. And they're writing the forms, they're having their attorneys review it to make sure it's in compliance with the proposed settlement. And I think this is a good feature. And it applies not just to the showing agreement, it applies to the listing agreement itself, where a firm could have their own listing agreement. I mean, they have control over that. And then the same thing with the buyer representative agreement. They can develop their own form that makes sure it's in compliance with the settlement. So I think we're going to see some more creativity along the lines of the contracts that agents are going to have to sign. And remember, above all, ask your broker, because it has to be in tune with the broker's office policy. So you have to review that as well.
All right. All right. Next week, we've got a live session webinar. Those are always fun. We got a lot of questions. we'll get into what's happening next with, hopefully, with NAR. There are a lot of lawsuits out there coming up. There's one that came up against Move. Realtor. I know you guys saw that Realtor.com on Move. I was like, what? That's
No, they haven't stopped. They keep it coming.
it's crazy, guys. So thank you. I really appreciate both of you. Thanks for always helping out.
Hey,
Likewise,
likewise.
thank you.
See you next week.